By mid-afternoon, the surface had actually warmed up some. So much so, in fact, that the human had ended up removing his jacket and slinging it over his shoulder. It was almost as if the solar system's sun was giving off one last burst of encompassing warmth just before the bitter cold that was due to arrive in the coming days. Cadet had certainly felt a drop every night since landing here, so the feeling of the sudden heat wave was surprising. This planet's temperature gradient was definitely extreme. To go from nearly freezing temperatures to a mild one in a single day's time was alarming. Cadet looked at the human's back. He seemed completely unbothered by the planet's extreme thermal regulation, almost like it was completely normal. Cadet suspected with high confidence that it probably was to him. She added that to the growing list of concerning things that Death Worlders think are fine. Pretty soon she'd have to make a new mental page. It was filling up quick. Before long, the days seemed to pass them by as they got closer to their destination. Cadet stuck behind Andrew, following his every move and deliberate step through the underbrush, careful not to step on something she might regret. Luckily, the human had much larger feet than her, so she was mostly able to step in the exact same place he had cleared. Only problem was that some of the strides were significantly wider than she could follow, making it so she would have to do a bit of a flapping hop to the next boot print in the foliage. Andrew had laughed at that, much to her chagrin. It was then that Cadet heard a rushing sound. It was very faint at first, but as they got closer, Cadet realized it was the sound of rushing water. Lots of it. They both came around a hill and paused at the bank of a river. The water rushed over rocks in a swift current. It was almost as deep as she was tall. Huh, water's a bit high this season, he remarked. Cadet knew what was coming next and couldn't help a bit of wounded dignity from showing in her feathers. He turned to her, looking down. I think I'll have to carry across this one, Ket. This current's going to be a little rough, even for me, he said as he leaned down and began taking off his boots, oddly enough. Cadet watched with a strange fascination as he removed his foot coverings. She hadn't yet seen the human's feet without them, and was somewhat surprised by what she saw. They were strangely shaped with little stubby digits on the ends. Out of all the alien races she knew, not one of them had feet quite like this human. She knew of hooves, paws, and talons, of course, but not whatever these were. Odd, very odd. She made a mental note to ask about it later. After he removed his boots, he began rolling up his pant legs as far as they would go, and then looked over to her, a thoughtful look on his face. Catet's feathers flattened, not at all excited with what was coming next, but before she could even start grumbling about the idea, he bent his long legs into a crouch next to her in one fluid movement. He reached out with his left arm and bent towards her. She could see the thick muscles contract beneath the skin, something she was slightly unnerved by. Come on, hop on up. He tried to say encouragingly as he gestured with the opposite hand by tapping the bent arm in two audible pats. She looked up at him, unsure, as her crown feathers settled back against her head. She tried to stop a ruffle of her wings as she looked back down to the proffered arm. Well, she supposed it was better than him having to just pick her up like a piece of cargo. She made a swift hop up onto his arm, her wings half spread automatically in reflex to try and steady her landing as she gripped the skin. Her eyes widened a bit as she noticed her weight seemed to press down into it. It was somewhat pliant, but the arm itself did not move much as he held it steady. She was very careful not to grip too hard since she had never perched on a sentient being before. It was by far one of the strangest sensations she had ever felt. Beneath her talons she could feel the heat of his skin and the slight thumping of his pulse. She could even feel the wrapping of the dense muscles around his arm, which made her fully aware of every twitch and flex they made. She was utterly engrossed in these sensations as her eyes locked on her talons, trying to be as unobtrusive and careful as possible. You can hold on a little tighter, you know. The human's baritone voice suddenly spoke, slightly humorous. My arm's not made of glass. She flinched her head up, her eyes actually slightly above the human's for once. She blinked twice before gripping her talons more securely on his arm. She instantly felt silly for even considering that such a thing could bother him, let alone hurt him, and couldn't help but the slight puffing of her neck feathers. She looked away swiftly, unwilling to let him see her embarrassment. You're right, it's probably made of beryllium alloy, she grumbled. He let out a loud chuckle at that, her platform shaking with it. She had to open her wings slightly to keep her balance. He seemed to notice, calming his movements, but then another one of his smirks appeared. I feel like a falconeer, he said as he straightened his back and puffed out his chest slightly. Cadet looked at the strange posture for a second before sighing. Will you ever realize I don't speak your native tongue? He actually looked a bit embarrassed about that. I can't help it. Common doesn't exactly have a lot of the words we use. At least I don't think it does. Didn't exactly have a lot of time to learn it, but anyway, a falconer is just a person who trains birds of prey for hunting. She looked thoroughly confused, tilting her head to the side before asking. You train a prey species to hunt for you? How would that even work? Andrew paused, not completely understanding why she was so confused when it suddenly clicked. Oh, you must understand. Birds of prey is actually a category for carnivorous birds. I guess we have a bit of a confusing name for them. Her eyes bugged out slightly at the statement as she leaned back a bit from him. So you actually train predatory birds to hunt for you? He shrugged, careful not to unbalance her perch. I guess so. I highly doubt it's an easy thing to do, though. Cadet continued to stare at him like he was out of his mind due to his nonchalant answer. Definitely gonna need that new mental page, Cadet thought. He chuckled at her bewilderment. Well, let's get across this river, shall we? The human reached down, grabbing the tied laces of his boots, and then slung them over his neck, being extra careful not to bump the alien perched on his arm. He walked up to the river bend, searching for the highest point in the stream before taking the first step. Cadet was worried at first, since the water ended up coming all the way up past his knees, but before she knew it, they were already on the other side. Cadet hopped off his arm to a nearby fallen tree-like log, watching as he maneuvered his pack around the front and pulled out a piece of cloth. He began drying off his strangely shaped feet before lacing up his boots. Base camp should be about 30 minutes or so from here. Good timing, too, since it looks like it's going to get dark soon, he said as he tied the last boot into place. Cadet nodded, more than eager to finally have a place to stay and bring an end to the consecutive daily treks through the forest. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. She wondered, not for the first time, what this base camp might look like. She hadn't been able to ask Andrew much about his time here, since he was very reluctant to talk about it. Whenever she'd bring the subject up, especially on how he ended up here, his answers were very vague, if he answered at all. That was something which definitely didn't leave her with a good feeling. Just how long had this human been stranded here? She was almost afraid to know, for if an all-powerful Death Worlder could not escape this planet, what chance would she have? It seemed the outlook was a bit bleak, but at least Andrew hadn't offered a refuge of sorts. That was already way more than she could ask for under these circumstances. Cadet? Cadet's head lifted up. She had stopped walking, apparently. Everything all right? Andrew asked, expressing slight concern. Yes, sorry, are we almost there? I'm just about ready to pull out my tail feathers if we have to walk another hour. He let out a small laugh. We're just about there, right over this hill. And true to the human's word, just as they passed over the large hill, Cadet could see some sort of clearing up ahead, along with a large rocky cliff that seemed to jut out of the ground in large jagged sections. As they got closer, Cadet noticed that there was a palisade buried next to the cliff, surrounding a section of the wall. Much to her surprise, there also appeared to be some sort of entrance to a cave within the cliffside. It looked to be blocked off at the moment by a large wooden door of an irregular shape to fit the natural opening. The human walked up to a gate along the barrier. It was a little taller than his waist, and Cadet had a hard time trying to see over it once they had come down the hill. He unlatched some sort of mechanism on the door and slid the plank over. They both walked inside the enclosure. She looked around and noticed a strange wooden outbuilding nestled against the wall of the cliff. Near the cave entrance, there appeared to be a damaged solar array covered in a large plastic sheet that was tied down over most of it, the top of which was littered with plant debris. She could see a tidy set of wires leading into the cave. Andrew looked down for a moment, giving a small smile. He gestured with his arm. Well, here we are. Mi casa es su casa. Translation, my home is your home, or something like that. Cadet was honestly amazed at what she saw so far. She could only imagine the amount of untold hours of labor it must have taken. Now, before we head inside, I'm going to check and make sure nothing has taken residence here since I've been gone. The wooden plank I made usually does the trick for most of the nasty stuff out there, but just in case. Cadet nodded, watching as the human set down his pack at the base of the entrance and pulled out his large scrap blade, strapping it in place along his hip somehow. With both hands, he gripped two sides of the wooden plank and yanked. It came loose after a few stubborn tugs. Then he carefully shifted it over to the left as he peeked inside, one hand on his blade. Cadet nervously waited a few moments as he slowly removed the barrier all the way. He nodded, turning around. Looks clear, come on. Cadet waited an extra second until he turned around and walked inside. She followed behind him, hopping up slightly onto the rocky base. After he had removed the door, there was actually a lot of light that filtered inside, and Cadet could see that the space was an odd mixture of high-tech salvage and crude survival practicality, all scattered throughout the cave in a somewhat messy manner. On the left, close to the entrance, was a long wooden table with all kinds of tools, wires, and damaged electronics, most of them in a disassembled state. There was also a decent pile of plasma weaponry next to the bench, some of which looked to be tinkered with, much to Cadet's apprehension. Against the wall of the cave were several braced shelves with a mix of metal and wooden storage bins and drawers, most likely for supplies. On the right side was a sleeping quarters with a wooden-like pallet and a soft bedding that appeared to be made out of some sort of native plant of this world. A few crude pillows and a folded patchwork blanket rested on top. Near the back, Tet saw a couple of neat stacked piles of dried wood. Next to that was a haphazard mess of more scrap metal, wires, and unknown electronics. Some of the electronics looked to be quite large and heavy. She couldn't have imagined how hard it was to move. And in the middle of the room, but closer to the front rather than the back, was a fire pit, which was surrounded by a circle of large rocks. A single smooth log stool sat nearby. For a moment, Cadet couldn't really fathom the amount of work it must have taken to make this space. Although it was incredible, it was also disconcerting. It raised questions, concerning questions. Cadet looked over to Andrew. He had set his supply bag on the table and started unpacking. He had what looked to be some sort of canvas bag in his hands as he turned around and began putting it away in one of the little storage bins against the wall. How long have you been here, Andrew? Cadet asked quietly to his back. The human stopped, his hand paused on a drawer mid-close as the cave delved into silence. It was a good moment or two before Andrew sighed, closing the wooden drawer in one slow push before he turned around. He continued unpacking the supplies from his pack, his eyes focused on his task. 6 years, he said simply to the table. She stared at him with wide eyes, feathers stiff. 6 years? Give or take a few months. When I first landed, things were a bit hectic. Didn't really have a clue as to what I was doing. She shook her head in disbelief. Andrew, that's... How have you not gone crazy yet? She didn't think she could survive even a couple of days on her own, much less a couple of years. His eyes glanced up for a moment, raising an eyebrow as his hands worked seemingly on their own. Who says I haven't already? Catet's feathers fell. I don't think you're crazy, Andrew, although you are a Death Worlder, which means you technically start with a default amount of crazy, but you seem to be relatively sane to me. Thanks. Good to know I haven't completely lost my marbles, for a Death Worlder at least. He finished storing away all of his supplies, hanging the backpack up on a mounted hook along the shelves. He walked over to her side of the table and leaned against it, folding his arms loosely. So I've got some leftover materials to make a few cushions and blankets. I can rig you up a place to sleep if you'd like. She nodded up at him, thankful. All right, I'll get a fire going first, and then work on that. Feel free to get comfortable wherever, he said as he walked towards the back of the cave. Cadet walked over to the fire pit and hopped up on the log stool. She watched as he prepared the fire, coaxing the flame to life on the dry wood. With the light of the fire, she took the time to look around the room again, trying to get any details she may have missed. It was then that she noticed some strange markings along the back wall, but most of it was covered up by a large sheet of metal. Cadet hopped down from her perch. What's this on the wall? She asked, curious. She looked behind herself after a couple of seconds of no answer and noticed Andrew staring. He then looked down after a good moment of silence, which concerned her. He looked pained. Before she could take back her question, the human stood up and walked over. She watched as he pulled the metal sheet aside. The revealed wall showed a strange set of markings, none of which she understood. It looked more like a drawing rather than writing, since it was spread out in irregular sections and appeared to be simple shapes rather than complex notation. She glanced up and saw that Andrew was just staring at it, almost blankly, before he blinked, as if coming back to the present. This is a map, he said. Cadet looked at the wall again as he walked up and pointed to the section in the corner. This symbol here means water, this one means mountains, this one cache, he said as he pointed to each one, and this one means spaceship. Catet's eyes widened. On the wall there were 5 markings for spaceship, each one scattered along the map, but somewhat following a general trend. You found other crashed ships? She asked, a bit breathless. He nodded, stepping back, eyes on the wall. Yes, and yours was the 6th. But yours was different from the rest. You were the first one I've seen survive. Catet's crown feathers fell back weakly, blinking as if in a daze. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked quietly. Andrew looked down, concerned, as he crouched down next to her. You just crashed your ship, Cat. The last thing I wanted to do was lay everything on you at once. The only reason you've been here so long is because so far you haven't found a way to leave. 6 years and you haven't found a way to escape, and the others that crashed here didn't even make it. She was surprised when she felt the human lay a gentle hand on her wings. Cat, the last thing you want to do is let those thoughts consume you. It'll get you nowhere. She heard what the human said, but Cadet didn't really know what to think, and the only thing she could feel was a sense of overwhelming hopelessness. It sat like a brick in her stomach and made her feathers shiver. It was a cold feeling, even with the heat of the human's hand on her feathers. She swallowed, hesitant but desperate. What types of things have you tried so far? Andrew hesitated before standing up, heading over to the long table. I've tried lots of things, trust me, most of which don't bear mentioning. My most recent project was to collect all of the... I don't know the word, but it could translate to black box, I think. It's the device that stores data in the event of a crash, he said as he bent over and pulled out something heavy from underneath the bench. It scraped along the ground. You mean flight recorder? She offered as she walked over slowly. I suppose that makes sense. So the idea was to get some positional data off this flight recorder here, so I can use the communication equipment I repaired to point it in the right direction. We both don't know where we are because we got ripped out of hyperspace unexpectedly. So we need to know where we are first before we start trying to contact some help. She nodded, still unsure. So what's the problem? He sighed. The problem is that I don't know how to fix this one. It's from someone else's ship. I tried fixing mine first, of course, but he paused, his eyebrows furrowing. But the data was corrupted somehow. It was a random mess of binary. So I went out to one of the other crash ships and took theirs. I mean, who knows? Maybe mine was a dud. But the problem is, I don't know anything about alien tech, Ket. I've tried to repair it multiple times, but I honestly got nowhere. Catette's feathers flicked up and her eyes sharpened on the box. I can repair it for you. Andrew looked a bit surprised, blinking. By all means, if you can fix it, you're more than welcome to try. She nodded, almost eagerly. Andrew squinted a bit with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. All right, tomorrow I'll show you where I keep everything, all the tools and such you'll need, he said as he stood back up and walked over to the fire. Cadet took her place on the log stool again. She relaxed her crown feathers and held her head up a bit higher. Finally. Finally, she had something she could work on. Something she could do about this situation. Repairing a flight recorder, even a damaged one, was something she was more than capable of, even if it looked to be from a Zalgaran ship. Cadet couldn't stop the trickle of hope from settling within her. The pit of ice from earlier was melting, little by little. She watched as Andrew poked at the fire again. He seemed to jolt for a second as if remembering something. He walked around to the storage area and began working on what she assumed was her place to sleep. Her feathers lifted a bit. So, the human needed help repairing something? Well, that she could do. Thanks again for watching. If you made it this far, I hope you liked it. And if not, you know what to do. And if you're interested and want to start a community or something like that, we have a link down to the Discord in the description. Thanks for watching again, and don't forget to look up and seek the stars.